Hello and welcome to the 8th module of the 12th lecture on sustainability and the environment, and I'm going to talk about sustainability a little bit in this talk and why GDP growth is not necessarily a very good measure of sustainable development. So this notion of sustainability. In 1987, the Brundtland Report defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we're still talking about the effect of environmental external costs on the future and the conservation of renewable resources, non-renewable resources. So there's a question, though, it's a bit ambiguous. Does it mean that we have to preserve everything we have now for the future, preserve the identical resources that we have now? Or does it mean that we should only conserve enough of those resources to make sure that everybody is able to lead a decent human life in the future? So that was a little bit, it's a bit unclear from what's said there. The resource economist Robert Solow clarified this. He suggested the following definition of sustainability. The duty imposed by sustainability is to bequeath to posterity not any particular thing. So not any particular thing, with some rare exceptions. And he actually mentions the Yosemite National Park and the Lincoln Memorial. But rather to endow them with whatever it takes, the future generations, to achieve a standard of living at least as good as our own, and to look after their next generation similarly. It's a sort of a recursive definition. This generation does for generation n+1, does for generation n+2, and so on. This allows that we can substitute resources. So technological innovation and sometimes upward pressure on prices can make it attractive to use substitutes. There's usually more than one way of doing anything. And the change in prices and the change in technology makes it possible to get by with what are now scarce natural resources. We substitute for them things that will not be scarce in the future. And definitely we're not constrained to preserve any particular things on the Solow approach. So is GDP growth a good measure of sustainable development? And I'm sure you're familiar with some of these things, but I'm just going to go through them anyway because they're worth reminding you of. Gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services. It doesn't include the components that go into the final product. It includes just the final product that's sold in the year. And it's during any particular year. It measures basically market activity. It doesn't actually measure directly human welfare. It measures market activity, how much is going on in the market, how much buying and selling is going on. But it suggests to the economic utilitarian that you've got a duty to grow the GDP in order to maximize the future satisfaction of preferences. Economic utilitarianism seems to imply that GDP growth is a good thing, as long as this market activity is a good indication of human welfare. Well, there are some problems with GDP as a measure first of human welfare, so I'm going to look at that first, and then I'm going to, in the next slide, I'm going to discuss its weaknesses as a measure of sustainability. The first thing is it's very abstract, and I mentioned this really. It's an abstract measure of market activity, not actually of human welfare, not of happiness or whatever. It doesn't survey people's happiness or anything. So all economic activity, anything that goes on, adds to GDP, even if it's destructive or unsustainable or regrettable. So it's abstract, it doesn't care. These all add to market activity, and so that seems to be a problem. It also ignores non-market transactions, such as, for example, housework, which adds to people's welfare, childcare, all these sorts of things that people are not paid for. As soon as you move childcare out of the household and into, say, the childcare center, you suddenly make GDP goes up because there's a market transaction. But the effect on human welfare is the same, or perhaps even there's a reduction if you think that childcare is not as good as home care for children. So GDP also ignores income inequalities. And as I mentioned last time, income has a declining marginal utility. And we've looked at that in our talk about the indirect utilitarian theories of justice, and we looked at it in terms of using future discount rates. As people get more and more income, the rate at which they get happy gets less. And if you've got a society in which there's huge income inequalities, some people have a huge pile of money and other people are very poor, they're not going to be as happy as a society which actually has the same amount of GDP, but in which the income is distributed more equally. So GDP calculations ignore those inequalities. And they ignore any, if there's human rights abuses going on, or on the contrary, you're living in a free country, GDP doesn't have a way of taking that into account. Now think about GDP. It's not a very good, it's got problems as a measure of human welfare, but it's also got problems as a measure of sustainability. For example, GDP is increased by pollution cleanup costs. The famous example is the Exxon Valdez that went aground off the coast of Alaska in 1989, and the United States gross domestic product actually went up with the cost of those cleanups. And that seems not the sort of measure that we want to increase as pollution has to be cleaned up. When you create pollution, you therefore create spending, and therefore you increase GDP. It ignores future external costs. Well, it's a market measure, and it captures only internal costs and benefits. So it doesn't measure any future costs that are being postponed into the future of cleanup. It also ignores resource depletion. There's no depletion allowance built into the GDP. There's no, as you use up the stock of oil in the world, there's no offsetting number into the GDP accounts that account for GDP resource depletion. It does, and this is important, GDP does include services, and services, growth in services, unless it involves more oil or something, more fossil fuels, which is not likely, growth in services, the value of that doesn't really use up resources. Okay, only some of the goods that are produced, the ones that use fossil fuels, the one that use steel, the one that use rare earth elements in making cell phones and so on, these use up resources. But services like selling people a course on business ethics use very very little resources. They generate income for the university, but so that gets measured in GDP. But the services, other than the costs of running the computers and so on that we're using, don't really involve much resource depletion. So that's worth bearing in mind. That's a but there is no depletion allowance built into GDP. The other thing to make is that GDP has a sort of false reputation of being value-free. That's why people like it. There's no value judgment being made. But see, you can, I think, now see that that's not actually correct. In incorporating the present cost of pollution cleanup and ignoring resource depletion, the GDP calculations do make value judgments. Okay? Despite their appearance of objectivity, they make value judgments. Now, it's true that other measures, like there are various green GDP measures that have been developed, and they have to do cost-benefit analyses in order to make estimates of this and that, and they maybe lose a little bit of objectivity, maybe, but it's still not correct to say that a green GDP measure makes a value judgment and GDP doesn't. GDP makes value judgments when it says that certain things don't matter, and when it says that this is the way to measure human welfare, and I think you can now see that. Finally, and this is almost another topic, the notion of green virtue. Just to go back to all the various ways we think about ethics, virtues are character traits, part of people's nature, part of their identity, that enable people and corporations and business firms to cooperate and flourish in societies with people with similar traits. And it's also true that a flourishing society has to be a sustainable society, right? So the virtues that will make a society sustainable and enable people to flourish in a sustainable society, that help create a sustainable society, are going to be good ones from the point of view of sustainability. They will be green virtues. Examples are the ones that you're taught on the side of almost every garbage truck that goes around the city. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. If you have those dispositions, you're going. If everybody had those dispositions, we're going to make the world a little bit more sustainable. All right, just to instill these concepts, which of the following is not a weakness of GDP as a measure of total sustainable human welfare? Pause the video and think for a second. Okay, we're looking for things that are not weaknesses, and they're not weaknesses either with respect to whether it measures human welfare or whether it's sustainable. It ignores CO2 cleanup by the ocean. Well, this is actually something that's good, and it's not incorporated into the GDP. So that is something that that is a weakness, and therefore it's not the answer. It ignores pollination services. Well, again, the same reason. These are things that are of value to people that aren't included in GDP. It ignores depletion. Well, it does that, but that is a weakness as a measure of sustainable welfare, so we can cross that off. It ignores the cost of the flour used to make commercial loaves of bread. Well, it's true that it does. It does ignore that, but that's because it concentrates on the value of final goods and services, not the components that go into them. And that's part of the way GDP is measured. And if it counted the cost of flour and then counted the cost of bread, it would double count, and that's what you have to be careful of. So that is not, in fact, a weakness of GDP. And then again, it ignores the costs of pollution that are neither cleaned up nor included in a firm's cost of production. Well, it's true, and that is a weakness. All right. So that concludes my survey of environmental issues in business ethics. And it also concludes our course. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that it hasn't been too awful. And I wish you the very best in your endeavors. And goodbye.